You have freedom. By the standards of most human beings who have ever lived, you have extraordinary freedom. Freedom of movement, of expression, of choice. And yet you are not using it, not fully. There are directions you have not moved in, commitments you have not made, versions of yourself you have not chosen, not because they were forbidden, but because you did not. Because the choosing required something that the comfortable arrangement of the current life made it easier not to do. Because freedom, it turns out, is not the pleasant open field the word suggests. You have freedom. By the standards of most human beings who have ever lived, you have extraordinary freedom. Freedom of movement, of expression, of choice. And yet you are not using it, not fully. There are directions you have not moved in, commitments you have not made, versions of yourself you have not chosen, not because they were forbidden, but because you did not. Because the choosing required something that the comfortable arrangement of the current life made it easier not to do. Because freedom, it turns out, is not the pleasant open field the word suggests. It is a demand, and the demand is exhausting. Simone de Beauvoir, whose philosophy of aging we explored in an earlier episode, and who was one of the most significant philosophers the 20th century produced, built the most demanding and most honest philosophy of human freedom available in the existentialist tradition. She said, "Freedom is not something you have, it is something you do, continuously, actively, against the weight of the habits and the comfortable arrangements and the social expectations that the free being keeps choosing to let organize the life in place of the actual exercise of freedom. The failure to use freedom is not neutral, it is a choice, the choice of bad faith, the choice of the person who prefers the comfort of being determined by forces outside themselves to the discomfort of determining themselves. And the cost of bad faith is the absence of freedom. It is the absence of the self." There is a specific dishonesty in the way most people relate to the constraints of their lives. The constraints are real, the obligations are genuine, the circumstances that limit what is possible are not invented, and the person who uses these real constraints as a complete explanation of why the life is the shape it is, who points to the external limitation as the full account of why the internal choosing has not happened, has told themselves a story that has some truth in it, and that is not the whole truth. De Beauvoir, inheriting and extending Sartre's existentialism while developing it in her own distinctly social direction, said, "The bad faith is precisely here, in the story that is not quite false and not quite honest. The story of the person who says, 'I would choose differently, but circumstances prevent it.' The story that takes the freedom that is genuinely present and locates it entirely in the conditions that are not yet right, that defers it to the moment that never quite arrives, that protects the uncomfortable reality of genuine freedom from having to be exercised right now." She is not denying that circumstances constrain. She was a woman in 20th century France, denied for years the political rights and social standing that her male colleagues held automatically. She understood structural constraint better than most. Her point is not that the constraints are imaginary. It is that even within the constraints, even in the specific, real, genuinely limited conditions that the life provides, there is always a freedom that is being used or not used, always a choice being made, always a self being shaped by the person who is doing the shaping, whether they acknowledge the shaping or not. The person who says they have no choice has more choice than that. The person who says circumstances determine them is making a choice to be determined, and the person who refuses to acknowledge this, who locates their freedom entirely in conditions that do not yet exist, while the actual, available, right-now freedom goes unexercised, is choosing bad faith, and bad faith has a cost. We have spent time with Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy of aging, the later episode in which she refused to make peace with growing invisible. What we have not fully explored is the earlier and more fundamental layer of her philosophy, the one that makes the aging argument possible, the one that is, in many ways, the foundation of everything. The Ethics of Ambiguity, published in 1947, is the philosophical work in which de Beauvoir most fully develops her own existentialist ethics, building on and departing from Sartre in ways that have only been fully recognized by subsequent scholarship. She had been working through these ideas since the wartime years, when the question of freedom under constraint, freedom under occupation, freedom under the genuine threat of death and collaboration and resistance was not an abstract philosophical puzzle, but the immediate, practical life and death question of what every French person was doing with their freedom while France was occupied. The central argument of the Ethics of Ambiguity is this: the human being is radically, inescapably free. Not free in the sense of unconstrained. The constraints are real and she acknowledges them fully. Free in the sense that no amount of constraint removes the fact of choosing. You can be imprisoned and you still choose how to be in the prison. You can be dispossessed and you still choose how to relate to the dispossession. You can be subject to the most severe external determination, and there remains always a freedom, sometimes narrow, sometimes vast, that is yours to exercise or refuse. This radical freedom is not a gift, it is a burden. The person who fully grasps their own freedom grasps simultaneously that the life they are living is the life they are choosing, that every accommodation, every compromise, every deferred possibility is their choice, made in the full exercise of the freedom that the bad faith story was keeping them from having to own. But de Beauvoir goes further than Sartre on a crucial point. Freedom is not merely individual. The freedom I exercise is entangled with the freedom of every other person. I cannot be genuinely free, cannot exercise my freedom in the full, authentic sense in a world where others are not free. The person who is free while others are oppressed is exercising a diminished freedom. Their freedom is real, but partial. The full exercise of freedom requires the active commitment to the freedom of others, not as a moral obligation added to the Freedom Project, but as the condition of the Freedom Project itself. This is where de Beauvoir's existentialism becomes political in a way that Sartre's did not always sustain. The freedom that is seized daily is not only the personal freedom of the individual choosing their life, it is the freedom that insists on the freedom of others, that refuses the comfort of the privileged position, that understands its own full exercise as requiring the expansion of freedom to those whose freedom is constrained by the conditions that the free person's comfort depends on. Now the bridge. Because de Beauvoir was writing in the specific context of post-war France, Sartrean existentialism, and the specific political crises of mid-20th century Europe, but here is what translates directly into the present life. The life that has been shaped more by accommodation than by genuine choice. The directions not taken, not because they were impossible, but because taking them required the kind of active, uncomfortable, genuinely costly choosing that the word freedom suggests, but the practice rarely delivers. The version of yourself you have been indefinitely postponing, the commitment you have been declining to make, the honest life you have been deferring to the conditions that have not yet arranged themselves. De Beauvoir is not condemning you for this. She is pointing at it precisely, naming the bad faith with the specific, non-judgmental clarity of a person who understands both how understandable it is and how costly. And she is asking, what would it mean to seize the freedom that is actually available? Not the freedom of perfect conditions, the freedom of right now, in this life, with these constraints, in the specific, genuine, always available moment of the actual choosing. The seizing is not comfortable. De Beauvoir never said it was comfortable. She said it was the condition of being fully, genuinely, actually alive. Here is what Simone de Beauvoir on freedom asks of you practically, today. First, Find the bad faith. The story you are telling about your constraints that is not quite false and not quite complete. The external limitation that is real and that has become, in the telling, a more complete explanation of the shape of the life than it actually is. The deferral that has been dignified as patience. The accommodation that has been called wisdom. The choosing not to choose that has been renamed as the situation not yet being right. Name it. Not with self-condemnation. De Beauvoir understood that bad faith is the natural response of the being who has grasped the full weight of their freedom and found the weight uncomfortable. But name it, because the named bad faith can be replaced with the genuine choosing. The unnamed bad faith keeps running as the operating system. Second, make one genuine choice. Not the adjustment, not the optimization. The actual, uncomfortable, burns the bridge behind you choosing that the genuine exercise of freedom requires. One thing, in the relationship, the work, the life's direction, where you stop deferring to the conditions that are not yet right and choose from the conditions that actually are. De Beauvoir would say, the conditions will never be completely right. The freedom is never more available than it is right now. The choosing you have been postponing until the freedom feels less costly is the choosing that will still be postponing itself 10 years from now. The freedom is not given, it is seized, and seizing requires the willingness to bear what the seizing costs, which the deferral was always costing you anyway, just silently and over time. Third, notice the freedom in the constraint. This is de Beauvoir's most demanding practical instruction. Even within the genuine constraints, the real limitations, the actual circumstances that narrow the range of what is possible, there is always freedom. Always the choice of how to be in the constraint, how to relate to it, what to make of it, whether to be determined by it or to determine something within it. Find one genuine constraint in your current life and ask, within this constraint, what freedom exists that I am not exercising? What choosing is available that I have been treating as if the constraint made unavailable? This is not the forced positivity of people who say constraints are secretly gifts. It is the specific de Beauvoir-grade philosophical honesty of recognizing that the freedom within the constraint is still freedom and still mine to use or not use. Fourth, extend the freedom outward. The freedom seized for yourself is partial if it is only for yourself. This is de Beauvoir's political point translated into the daily life. One person in your circle whose freedom is constrained by conditions you have the capacity to address, not in the grand political sense necessarily, but in the specific, local, available form that the lives near you present. The colleague whose voice is not heard. The relationship where one person's freedom is consistently purchased at the other's expense. The community where the expansion of one group's freedom requires the active engagement of those who already have it. The full exercise of freedom requires this engagement, not as charity, as the recognition that the freedom you have seized for yourself is in de Beauvoir's precise and demanding formulation, not fully yours until it is part of the expansion of freedom for others. I want to close with the image that stays with me when I think about de Beauvoir on freedom. Not the Café de Flore, not the decades alongside Sartre, not the extraordinary body of work produced across 50 years of writing. The wartime notebooks, the journals she kept during the German occupation of France, in which she worked through the question that the occupation made immediate and unavoidable. What do you do with your freedom when the conditions for its exercise are genuinely severely constrained? What does it mean to choose genuinely, honestly, fully, when the choices available have been narrowed to what the occupation allows? This is not the forced positivity of people who say constraints are secretly gifts. It is the specific de Beauvoir-grade philosophical honesty of recognizing that the freedom within the constraint is still freedom and still mine to use or not use. She carried this conclusion forward into the ethics of ambiguity, into the second sex,
into everything she wrote about what the genuine, fully exercised, costly daily practice of freedom requires of the person who has been given it and keeps declining to use it. The freedom is not given, it is seized every day in the actual conditions that are actually present by the actual person who is actually here, which is you, right now, in exactly these conditions, with exactly this freedom. What are you going to do with it? Here is the question Simone de Beauvoir on freedom leaves us with today. Not from the cafe, not from the occupied Paris or the post-war philosophy or the 50 years of extraordinary work, from the notebook, from the question she was working through in real time, in conditions that were genuinely terrible, with the full honesty of a person who had decided to stop accepting the comfortable story. Where is your bad faith? Where is the freedom you have available right now, in these conditions, in this life, with these constraints that you have been treating as if the conditions make it unavailable? And what would it mean to seize it today? Not tomorrow, not when the conditions are right, today, in the actual, unglamorous, fully available form that the actual freedom of the actual life presents? Leave that in the comments, because naming the unseized freedom and deciding to seize it is the beginning of what de Beauvoir called the genuine, fully exercised, daily practice of being free. Not the pleasant field the word suggests, the demanding, daily, worth every cost practice of actually living the life you are actually free to live. I'll see you in the next one.